Hey everyone, my name is Brett James. I want to talk to you today very briefly about the historiography of NASCAR. Uh, there are essentially two approaches. The first is empirical, the second approach is cultural, which is where sports history is tracking right now. If we look at the empirical side, the debate more or less is on the sport's origins. So NASCAR was founded in 1948. Um, and many of you know that there is definitely a link between moonshiners and stock car racing. Um, However, the debate is on how much of an influence moonshine had on the creation of NASCAR in particular. Um, Daniel S. Pierce, he is a professor at UNC Asheville. He wrote a book called Real NASCAR that came out in 2010. And he comes down on the side of moonshine directly leading to the creation of NASCAR. And basically, the idea here is that, in general, that moonshine runners, they were either so good at outrunning the law that they wanted to show off their skills, or that they wanted to go legitimate, that they started racing one another and organized events. The other school of thought, which is the one that I subscribe more to, is that there's very little link between moonshiners and NASCAR. That some were a part of it, people like Junior Johnson, but most were not. And people like Scott Beekman, whose book on NASCAR's broad history. We've also got a Rice University professor, Randall L. Hall. He's written a couple of articles about stock car racing well before NASCAR's creation. So that is the big debate, I guess you could say, within the historiography of NASCAR on its origins. NASCAR is not the only sport that has origins that are mythologized, more or less, whether they're true or not. You know, in baseball, Abner Doubleday, many people know the story that he created it. We know for a fact that he did not. In any case, that's the empirical side of things, and obviously it has a major place because it's important to understand where the sport came from. The other side is the more cultural approach, and that's the side that I'm more interested in. Now, in 1995, we had maybe the first dissertation on NASCAR was Mark D. Howell's From Moonshine to Madison Avenue. It got published as a book in 1997. It takes a very broad approach to the sport at the time. It has a sociological aspect to it as well. But he has chapters dealing with things like NASCAR and unions, NASCAR and control over the sport, which, to make a little an aside, NASCAR not only has the sport, obviously, but they also control many of the tracks that are raced on. So there's kind of questions about antitrust laws going on today. But in any case, he wrote the first sort of cultural approach, and he's written, or edited, I should say, a book called Motorsports and American Culture, and many of those chapters are on NASCAR. It's a more recent book. It's very good. Now, we've also got some more specific cultural things like the death of Dale Earnhardt. You know, that was a huge cultural moment for the sport and the fans in particular, and how fans dealt with that is a very interesting thing, which Richard Ian Kimball, he wrote a chapter on Dale Earnhardt's death in his book Legends Never Die, which is about athletes and their afterlives. And basically Dale Earnhardt has become a cult figure, almost a saint, I guess you could say, to many people. And even today, his merchandise, 25 years later, his merchandise is among the top 10 sellers of any of the drivers out there, which is a remarkable thing to consider. Now, if you're familiar with NASCAR, you know that the fans are different breeds. So we've had recent dissertations on the fans and what makes them different from other fandoms. We've seen recent dissertations, especially on some of the more trendy topics like race and gender and masculinity. NASCAR is it's changing a little bit, but historically it has been a sport dominated by white men. So there's a lot of aspects for people, obviously, to research in those areas. Now, we've also got things dealing with NASCAR's importance in the South. Ben Shackelford, he's written a couple of things dealing with the importance of NASCAR in the South and how NASCAR used Confederate nostalgia around the centennial mark of the Civil War to boost its popularity in the South. And there's a lot of interesting things in that regard. What we haven't seen, though, which is where I believe I can come in and fill this gap, are works dealing with NASCAR during its boom years. In the 90s through the early 2000s, about 2004, NASCAR was experiencing a period of tremendous growth, and things like new tracks were added to the schedule, which meant that old tracks were dropped from the schedule. And the cars changed. Dodge returned, which brought a lot of nostalgia to people. But Toyota came into the sport, and that made a lot of people very upset. The type of drivers changed. They went from being blue-collar, good old boys to being more, media-savvy spokesmen who could also drive. And these companies are shelling out $15 million a year to be on the car. So you can understand why they would want that. But the period also brought the introduction of a controversial playoff system to determine the season champion. So, all these changes were done one way or another to help the sport grow. But at what point in time, it's a ship of Theseus situation. At what point in time does the sport change from what it was, and it's no longer that original thing anymore? In any case, I want to look at the reactions and the rationale behind these changes. I personally believe that many of these changes led to a decline in popularity around 2008, but that's too recent for us to get into. So I'm just going to focus on these changes that were taking place during its growth years, and I'm really excited about what this can lead to, and I'm looking forward to it. Thanks for watching.